Hey folks, it's so good to see everybody. We're here today with two members of the V0 team, Zeb and Ali, and we're here to talk about how to make the most of prototyping with V0. We're super excited. We're going to kick things off with a quick demo, actually, of how we use V0 to prototype V0 itself. Then we'll talk a little bit about what our philosophy is about prototyping with V0 in general. And then we'll spend most of the time just taking your questions. And with that, I'm going to get started with a demo. So, for those of you who aren't familiar, this is V0. V0 is your tool to build web apps, all with natural language. And what we're going to show you quick is how we actually prototype things for V0 using V0 itself. And the way we start off is we actually have a template already shared with our entire team that actually has a mini version of V0 built within V0 itself. So this is a really great place for us to start when we're trying to prototype things that work or don't work in V0, because we actually already have a version of the application that's kind of a mocked light version uh, that does 90% of what the actual application does. So when we want to actually modify things, so recently we've been experimenting a lot with how do we actually improve conversion for our signed out line, like login landing page here. And one of our hypotheses is that this 5 buttons we have going on here are actually not doing a ton to drive conversion. We've looked at the events data, we've looked at analytics data. They don't get clicked a ton, and users who click them don't have more engaged sessions than users who don't. That's a pretty good indication that these suggested actions are not actually doing what we intend them to do. We hope that they would give users a good sense of what you could do with V0, but it seems like that's not the case. So we're going to talk today about how we would go about actually kind of experimenting with a different strategy for having suggested prompts exist in the V0 generation. So I'm going to start off with the PM's favorite tool, which is a screenshotting tool, and actually just take a screenshot of the part of the application that I am going to try and modify here. And so what that for me is going to be is just this like section of the prompt form here. That's the part I care about the most. And what I'll do is I'll quickly just outline the exact part I want to change and give it to V0. And what I'll ask it to do is something like, hey V0, I want to try removing these suggested actions. Let's instead experiment with, I want to try some like rotating placeholder text. So I want to actually show what the text would look like if you typed it into the prompt form itself. So let's experiment with, let's just say rotating placeholder text in the main input. And I want it to have example prompts in it. And let's start with a defined example prompt. So we actually have something immediately when you land on the page, something already will exist. And chosen from, let's say like a set of 10. I think 10 is a reasonable number to try to iterate through. And what I really want is for it there to be like a typing effect. So when we rotate between them, instead of just flipping between, it should look like you stopped typing and then started retyping. And so I'll say like, let's add a typing effect when you need to rotate out text. It should look like we're backspacing character by character and then quickly typing out a new prompt. So that was a bit of a long prompt, but I have a pretty good idea of what I want to try out. And so we're going to see what V0 cooks with. And so the first thing you'll notice that I actually wrote a pretty detailed prompt. We recommend this for all of our use cases, especially when you're doing something like prototyping, something that you have in your head. As specific as you can be with what you're actually trying to get, the better V0 will perform. Here I had a pretty good sense of exactly what I wanted. And so I was able to give V0 very specific information about what exactly it is that we were trying to build here. And so what you'll see is that V0 will first take some time to think through what the best solution is here. It saw the screenshot. It was able to look at exactly what I was trying to replace. And it's kind of laid out a mini plan for how to do this, which is first, let's understand what we have in the code base. Let's remove the suggested actions. Then let's actually create the functionality I want, which is this like type out and then backspace kind of experience. And so we'll see that V0 did exactly what it said. It explored the code base first, found the suggested actions that it needed to remove, read that page, and now it's actually writing the code to implement the feature I wanted. And there we go. So here's we've gotten rid of the
Beautiful.
actions, and we got the effect I wanted, which is that you type out the prompts, then you very quickly get rid of all the text, and then you type out the next prompt. And so this would be a really easy way for us to test out. And now for me to get feedback from our engineering and design folks on us, like, what do we think? Does this look good? Does this sound right? And yeah, this is how we prototype with V0. And yeah, I'll pause there and actually turn it over to Zeb.
All right, the one other thing I actually wanted to share is just the visual editing overview, right? So,
Yeah.
what we've commonly seen with PMs in particular and designers is just often the chat gets it right, but sometimes it gets it slightly wrong. And being able to just override something or like make a small visual tweak to the copy or whatever it is really helpful. So, I'd love to see that too.
Yeah, 100%. And so what I'll show you is here's another kind of cool example of a kind of generation already built partially in V0. And what you can do is actually from the prompt form itself, turn on design mode. And what design mode lets you do is it gives you deterministic controls to actually edit what you see on the screen. And so you can see here we have these like Figma style controls that actually allow us to modify what we see on the screen. We get a live preview of what it is that we're playing with. And then if we kind of click enter, let's say we wanted to um, make this a little lighter. Maybe that's lighter. Okay, definitely not monospace. Honestly, the sans serif is best,
Terrible.
but for
Yeah,
the
we
sake
got
of
the
it,
right
we're
one
gonna
the
do the
first time.
serif. And basically, we can modify the properties of the actual elements we see on the screen. And whenever we're ready, we can just click save. And we now have an updated version of this generation that actually has the styling properties I changed there. And if we want to share this with someone, what we can do is actually just publish this. And let's say I only want to publish it to members of my team and only make it visible to a certain set of people. I can actually change the visibility of the deployment I go with. Let's say we choose password protection here, and I can set the password to be effortless custom. That's the first two words on the screen that I see. I can click save. And now when I publish this to production, it's going to take some time to deploy, but the deployment will actually have a password protected deployment. So if I wanted to share this with a member of my team or with an external client to get feedback from them, I could actually just share this published app with them, and they'll, it won't be accessible to the World Wide Web.
Killer. Okay, I'm going to run through a couple of slides very quickly. I know we're slightly behind time, but wanted to share. Basically, we get asked all the time about this shift from PRDs to prototypes and the role tools like V0 are playing in that. So this is a talk I've given a number of times lately that I'll do the lightning version of. So the traditional way we built software, it took many weeks. I'm sure people remember like waterfall, the waterfall approach to shipping software, which feels like wildly outdated now, but was a real thing like earlier in my career. Um, what we've seen instead, especially in the last few months, really the like proliferation of this in a matter of months is kind of mind-boggling. 3 months ago, I talked to product leaders, and like most of them weren't really adopting prototypes, and nowadays it feels like almost 100% are. So there's really this idea of a prototype over a PRD or a prototype instead of a PRD. What's amazing about tools like V0 and being able to prototype in like 5 minutes is that basically at every stage of the product development process, you can actually create a working version of the thing you're describing. So if you remember a year ago, even somebody in the chat asked about working with design. The best way to communicate the idea that Ari showed of that written text showing up would probably be a few different Figma files that showed like various stages and then a written description or like a voiceover that said like, oh, the text like enters and it takes approximately how long it would take a human to type and it probably pauses so it feels more human. And all of that is like hard for the listener to understand. But nowadays, if you can build in 5 or 10 minutes or an hour like a working prototype, that communicates your ideas much more clearly. And so what we've seen is that people are doing this at every stage in the process, right? So I'm coming up with an idea, I'm trying to play around with different ways we could improve the new user experience, or I'm talking to a customer and they have something that they've been really interested in. I want to validate the approach that we're taking with it. Basically, everywhere along product development, people on our team and then people at our customers are using V0 or tools like it to build prototypes and actually like validate that with their teammates, with their designer, with their customers, etc. So what Well, I showed that slide earlier that started basically a progression, a linear progression. And what we're seeing now is that it's much more flowy, it's much more interactive. And rather than like decide the beginning of Q1, here's everything we're going to ship at the end of Q1, it's we decide Monday afternoon, hey, I have this cool idea. I'm going to create prototype of it. I'm going to share it with somebody on the design team who's going to tell me why it's wrong or what could be better about it. I'll go and I'll talk to a couple of users or I'll send it in our ambassador Slack or whatever it is. And then a few hours later, we can actually ship that improvement live to production. So it's really just like a reimagining of how people build software. Obviously, we're the people who build B0, so we have a vested interest in this. But something I love is the number of customers. Here's a guy, Eric Schwartz, who just tweeted this recently. It's been a huge unlock for how I communicate with engineers and designers. The thing that I've seen there is that in the past, each person, each team had kind of a different communication medium, right? So engineers would talk in code, PMs in written documents, designers in Figma files. And nowadays, all those folks can actually communicate in the same medium, which is like a working prototype or early version of the thing that they're planning or interested in shipping. That's enough of our pre-scheduled content. We'd love to hear your questions and just open up the conversation.
So you can use the Q&A function to submit questions for us to answer. So on the bottom of your screen, you'll see a little Q&A tab. If you go in there and just write us questions, we'll be able to see them and we'll pick some of the most interesting ones to answer.
I know I saw one. I don't know where it went to, but there was one about, oh, there it is, Q&A. In a few months, would PRDs go away? So this is a great question. Ari, I'd love your take on this. My take is that actually a prototype without anything written in conjunction with it kind of also is bad. The place that we've run into, as an example, like recently we did a bunch of work with how user permissions work for very large organizations using V0. And prototypes are great for something like the user onboarding flow, right? Communicating that. But it turns out for something like what is the specific exact set of resources that each person has access to? Trying to communicate that in a prototype is a lot harder than like a table, right? And so there's lots of these cases where you want both the view of like what's the user flow, how does the product look, what's it going to feel like, and then the written doc that answers like the key questions or defines the like this is the exact logical structure that this needs to follow.
Yeah, 100%. I think the like a PRD has the meat of a PRD is actually two sections typically. It's what are the user flows and what is like the actual specifications of the feature you want. Those are two areas that are actually sometimes much easier to do via prototype. And so PRDs definitely have gotten shorter now that you can include a prototype in them. But there's still very important parts of a PRD that have to still be in there, right? Like what is the business goal we're trying to achieve, right? Like what are the things we're definitely not trying to do? There are different things that you definitely want to be able to include a narrative around. But the meat of the PRD, which is typically like, let me write a 6 section like feature specification for all the different cases that we need to cover. That part is substantially simplified by including a very good prototype instead.
You want to take this next one on
Yeah.
template for PRDs?
The question is that is there a preferred template for the PRDs that work best with the V0 agent? That's a really good question. Typically there isn't like a really standardized format that you should try to use. There are characteristics of prompts that work really, really well. Two we've already talked about. One is like use screenshots to describe exactly visually what it is that you're trying to reference. As a PM, you probably already use a screenshotting tool as like your number one tool. V0 is a great way. V0 is just like any other team member of yours. It's very useful to use screenshots to describe what you want. The second is give detailed prompts when necessary. So if you actually do have a clear idea of something in your head, it is actually very much worth it to spend a little extra time writing out a prompt with the detail that you want. It's much easier to get V0 to get the right answer correctly first by giving it a detailed prompt than getting the wrong answer and then spending 10 more messages trying to figure out how to fix it to be what you wanted originally. So those are two things I would definitely do. The third and fourth is if you have different ideas for what responsive like mobile and tablet views should look like, also give it that information. V0 will be responsive by default. It'll try to create a responsive view regardless if you don't put any information in. But if you have a very specific vision of, hey, on mobile, I want this very different interaction than I do on desktop, you should definitely describe that. Um, and the third thing is like you can write out user flows just like you do in a PRD and give them to V0 for more complicated things. So if you have an idea for like, hey, in this state, this is the flow in this state, this is the flow, you should give V0 that information as well.
Yeah. The one thing I would add for prototyping specifically is often it's useful to not create one mega gigantic prototype that explains everything you want to do with the product. If let's say you're shipping like an entirely novel product, but rather like as that example I gave of user permissions, what's the new user experience when they're accepting an invite? What's the experience of the admin when they're actually configuring who has access to what resources? What's the next set of things? And each of those can be kind of their own distinct thing. And it turns out V0 is just much better at like a more defined tractable problem rather than if you give it like a 14-page PRD and ask it to perfectly build that concept and make no mistakes.
Cool. I see another question here for how do we maintain such a clean V0 version of V0 to build and demo from? In my experience, rebuilding our product in V0 has proven challenging. What is the process you follow to make the template results so clean and realistic? Super good question. A few answers here. First, this is actually not a one-to-one mapping of the actual V0 interface. It would spend we would spend a lot of time trying to get a perfect exact version of V0 to work inside V0. What we wanted, the goal here is really to have a representative version of V0 for us to be able to like prototype and test things with. So you'll notice that there's a lot of polish that's not there in our kind of mini template prototype version that is actually there in the real product. So that's the first thing. It's like you actually have to be okay with this is a prototype, right? The intention is to have a representative example of the product. The second thing is you can actually start, I would highly recommend starting with a screenshot. So start with a screenshot of your existing UI, ask V0 to like recreate it on the fly. And in particular, if you set up a design system or a theme in advance, like those are good ways to get off the ground very, very quickly. And the third thing I'd say is actually don't try to build the entire application all together at once. So this actually, the demo I showed you is just the homepage. We have a different template for the chat page. We have a different template for the community page, a different template for the profile. So you actually don't need one massive generation that has every single part of your application all together in once. If you have 3 or 4 key user flows or key pages in your app that you consistently go back to and experiment with, actually have those be separate and have the logic for them be independent.
Yeah, I think that's a great idea. The other thing I would say is that like big organizations that use V0 a lot, right? Like we have very large enterprises that have hundreds of PMs and designers in V0. They do spend a few hours making their dashboard or their chat experience or whatever. They have somebody on the team who just dedicates their time to building a great, it's called a team template for that resource. And yes, it's like a bit of extra work to keep prompting the tool to make sure that it really is excellent and like at the level of quality that you're looking for, but that's reusable, right? So it's not like a one-off thing where everybody each time they prototype something has to create it from scratch. You can just have that team template and just like Ari showed, just start from there as opposed to start from rebuilding this again, which obviously eats up lots of time.
Yeah,
I'd
100%.
love to,
And
oh, go ahead.
oh yeah, I was saying the last part of it is you can actually have a different function also own that. So for example, our design team, our designer
Yeah.
for V0 owns these team templates. Whenever we make updates to the UI, she goes in and updates those templates so that they're still accurate. And then product engineering, everyone else on Vercel V0, we're consumers of these templates. So it actually helps to have kind of a separation of concerns here, similar to how you would organize a design system where your design team owns a design system, your other teams are consumers of that kind of product. A team template you can kind of think of the same way.
So there's this question I was really excited about, which is what's the best way to use V0 prototypes to accelerate writing PRDs? The I think the mental model there is different than the mental model that we have nowadays. So basically what we've seen is that the actual way that you figure out the right product to build is very different nowadays than it was even a year or two ago. The best example of this I actually saw from a handful of YC founders at the last batch, where they would go to customer meetings or prospect meetings with folks that might buy their product, and live in the meeting, they're vibe coding based on the like discovery, the questions they're asking their customers. So if it's a cybersecurity company and the person is articulating, oh, it's hard to understand these types of threats, they're having V0 actually build them a visualization that like collates and displays the specific information that the person is talking about. And halfway through the meeting, they just turn around their machine and say, like, is this what you're describing? And when that happens, like the best possible thing the customer can say is like almost, or like that's basically right, but you actually missed these things because it tells you that they're like directly engaging with the thing and they're actually thinking about how they'd use it in their workflow. That's very different than a traditional like product development process where I, as a PM earlier in my career, would go to 15 customer meetings, listen to them, ask all my discovery questions, turn that into a big set of notes, then write a document, then go to designs. So it's much more interactive and it flows back and forth much more frequently. So basically, we'll have an idea live in a meeting. We'll create that concept live in that meeting. Then we'll actually look at three of them that we created with different customers and start writing the PRD based on that. Then with that PRD, we might go to V0 and just input it and have it output like a conglomerated, like what would the prototype look like if we looked at all of these customer conversations and all the feedback we received. So generally, that's the shift that we've seen is it's less like spend 2 weeks creating this one document and more let's move between customer conversation and writing the PRD and building the prototype back and forth and validating at each step along that process.
Yeah, cool. We see next the next question I see is, as a PM, how do I get designers on board who seem to be a bit behind in the times? I'm showing them V0 prototypes and I can tell that they feel like their toes are getting stepped on. But the reality is I can get an idea out in an afternoon that might take them weeks. This is a really good question.
Yeah.
And it does depend team to team. What we've seen be really successful for like larger enterprise and larger teams is to use V0 in conjunction with design. So there's two ways to do this. The easiest way is V0 is really great for like early stage prototypes. You still might want high fidelity designs to come after that. When we build features into V0, we typically start off with a like low fidelity prototype that takes the place of like lo-fi designs that a designer would typically make. This is used for alignment. It's our communication tool to make sure that we are trying to ship the same thing. And then we still do have designers go in and make high fidelity mockups in Figma of like exactly what the UI should be, what should the exact border radius be, what should the exact kind of fonts, things like that should actually be. So that's one thing. The second thing is you can actually get your designers to use V0
Yeah.
themselves. That's the thing we love to see. And actually, designers are some of the most excited people to use things like V0. An easy in, like a good selling strategy is complex interactions and page transitions that are very, very hard to do in Figma are actually very easy to do in V0. A good example is this like typing out text and like deleting text effect that I had basically V0 do in one prompt. To do that in Figma, what you'd have to actually do is like create 3 or 4 different Figma screens that walk through the different like states of this process, right? So you need one for the empty state, one for the like typing state, one for the delete state. And then you're like if you put those in a prototype, you actually have to wire them like frame by frame in Figma. So those kinds of things are way, way easier to do in V0. And that's actually a really great place for designers to start using V0.
One of the tactics that we've seen lots of big organizations that use V0 do, but also honestly like smaller community groups or hacker groups or whatever, is just, hey, we're going to create a like no expectations environment for people to play with these types of tools, right? And so like very large financial institution just did a hackathon where they had like hundreds and hundreds of both designers and product people and other folks around the organization using this tool. A lot of the time, people are skeptical of like someone forcing them to use something or saying you have to change the way you work. But if they actually get to experiment with it and play around for themselves, they can realize exactly what Ari just said, which is there's a bunch of stuff that I've struggled to do in the past or has taken me many hours that now I can do in 10 minutes. And that can be like a light bulb moment and really empowering for them. So something I'd recommend is if you're in that situation, what if you like set up a Friday afternoon or something where the team does some sort of a hackathon and everybody comes up with their prototypes? That the change management that we've seen from organizations that do this, it really changes the dynamic from like you're coming after my job or like I don't want to work in this new way into wow, this is cool. I feel empowered. This is something I'm excited to start using myself. Next question we could hop into is as more AI-powered app builders emerge, how should we think about V0's focus and moat? Is it speed, quality of generated code, or something deeper around workflows? It's a great question. Obviously, there are many entrants in this market. I think it's like the most contentious, most highly fought after market I've ever seen. There's new ones that launch every week. I think somebody told me more than half of the YC companies are building something like V0. There's two things that we're incredibly focused on. One is the quality of the outputs that V0 generates, right? And so something I love to do is just side by side use the other products, give the same prompts, try and build the same prototype and see what the actual output quality is. Our customers do this all the time, and I think it's a great way to just figure out like what actually is the highest quality product here. The second one, and something that matters a lot to our bigger customers, is just the security, right? So there's like amazing tools that do very interesting things that are built by three-person teams and very early stage companies. And obviously, those companies are primarily investing in the product itself, not the underlying security of it. V0, because we're part of Vercel, has this unfair advantage that we have 10 years of things like making sure that it's impossible for folks to publish applications that have insecure API keys or that have their database credentials leaked publicly, or making sure that access management restricts the actual resources that users have access to so that a random V0 designer or PM can't go in and accidentally delete production. So I think the security side is another place that we feel like we have an unfair advantage against many folks in the market.
Cool. I see a question for, do you have resources for learning how to set up your design system in V0? Super good question. The easiest way to find out is actually just by trying it. If you open up the sidebar in
Do you
V0,
want to show it, Ari?
I actually am about
I
to show
love this.
it. Give me 1 second here. The easiest way for you to test it is actually just by trying to build one yourself. So if you go into the sidebar, you'll see there's a design systems, new design systems tab. And what this lets you do is basically very, very quickly build kind of modded versions of V0 generations that look very, very different from the like traditional ShadCN black and white. So here's an example of a like Studio Ghibli-esque design system that TweakCN, who's one of the folks on the V0 team working on this, actually is messing around with right now. And so what this lets you do is actually define design tokens that V0 knows and understands and can use in generations. So you can see here we have colors, we've got some border radiuses, we've got shadows, we've got typography. And so this is like the first ship for us to be better about making V0 generations look like and feel like your design system. So I'd highly recommend trying that out. Give it a shot. Give us any feedback as you try it. The thing we are actively sprinting towards right now is taking this one step further and actually letting you bring your own components into V0 and not just your own tokens. And we will hopefully have some very cool updates for you on that front soon.
Also, if you have a set of CSS tokens, you can just paste them in to V0 into the design systems tool, and it will automatically replicate them. So you don't have to manually go in and set each of these colors yourself.
Yeah.
Do we have time for one more, or is that our last question here?
I think we have time for one more. How does V0 handle revisions or updates to a PRD? What's a good practice? Provide just updates, feed it in chunks, or provide the whole PRD? That's a good question. So if you have a prototype you've already built from an existing PRD and now you're updating that PRD, I would not recommend giving V0 the whole new updated PRD. It's too much context that it doesn't actually need to make the changes you want. I would just recommend giving it diffs. So whatever has changed, just talking it through like, hey, here's what's changed, here's what I want you to change. So framing it as like, here is the edit I want to make to what's already happened, as opposed to like, here is a net new, full, completely new requirement. Like, please update your generation to fit this completely new requirement. In that case, it's more likely V0 gets stuck in parts of the requirement that hasn't actually changed and gets confused. It's much better to give it more targeted information about how to do this thing.
The other thing I would say is if you like wrote your PRD and then you talk to customers, you talk to leaders around the company and realize you got 50% of it wrong and you totally rewrite it, that diff is going to be very large. In that case, I would just take the rewritten PRD and give that to V0 in a new chat and just have it start over. And I think you'll probably get to better quality outputs if you approach it that way.
Great. I think that is our last question. Um,
If folks, so basically the place we wanted to end is if you're interested in using V0, you can just use it yourself. We have a generous free plan, and then it's very easy to sign up for a paid subscription as well. If you're a larger company and you have specific questions around security or how you go through the change management of getting more folks at your company to adopt a prototyping tool like V0, please feel free to contact our team. V0.app/enterprise has a bunch of resources and then an easy contact button to get in touch with somebody who will be able to answer every question you have.
Thanks
Thank
so
you.
much for spending time with us. We're excited to see what you guys build.